All right, the next thing we need to consider is the way that Prussia was able to successfully harness national, manage the emergence of liberal democracy, and create a different kind of modern centralized state. So centralization doesn't necessarily need to move along the path of creating a modern state like we saw in England and the United States. Centralization could create a regime of relative inequality. And this is the sort of Prussian experiment that successfully creates Germany as the most powerful continental empire in Europe. So let's talk a little bit about how Bismarck does this. Bismarck is himself not the ruler of Germany. There are Kaisers who sort of emerge as the powers on the Prussian throne, really from the mid 18th century. Immanuel Kant worked for Kaiser Friedrich Wilhelm, and he praised him for his civilization and for his sort of religious open-mindedness and the degree of freedom that Prussia had intellectually. But remember what he says in What is Enlightenment is the duty to sort of obey. That's the primal kind of duty of a Prussian. And Bismarck then has to kind of bring together a vast array of political forces within Prussia and kind of manage the great game of European politics in a way that's going to allow Germany to emerge dominant. And I've deliberately chosen this photo of Bismarck because I think usually we see Bismarck presented as a militaristic figure with this iron hat and this point on the top of it. And you sort of see him alone kind of fighting. And Bismarck is actually a great reconciler and a diplomat. You sort of see him here with a group of politicians. Remember, he actually puts together something fairly impressive. The Holy Roman Empire has ended. And so Germany is now composed of this series of small little states, of the largest of which is Prussia, but there are significant other forces like Hanover and Bavaria who aren't interested in necessarily German nationalism. You see that there are Danes to the north and there are Austrians to the south, and there are not many of Germany's neighbors would like to see Germany consolidated into a single sovereign nation state. So how does Bismarck do it? I mean, one of the things that he does is to kind of work the class system within Germany. There are sort of three rough kind of, from a Marxian perspective, that you've got the industrial workers of Germany, the proletariat, and Germany in the West, in Westphalia and Rhineland, is emerging as a first-rate industrial power. They don't have the political centralization to really throw their muscle around. But modernization is happening rapidly there. And the workers are interested in radical ideas. Remember, Marx is a German Jew. There's a thought that perhaps this is a place from which organization is going to take place. You see the old kind of liberal middle class of Germany, the people that Kant might have represented. And they had initially been highly supportive of revolution and a French style kind of moving forward into enlightenment as the way forward for German nationalism. Remember, we talked about how Beethoven is originally he praises Napoleon as kind of bringing the French Revolution forward, and only once he sees that it's going to end in autocracy and centralization does he sort of begin to push back. And then you have the conservative Junkers, right? These are the agrarian lords in East Prussia, in West Prussia, but in kind of what would have been today, what would have been in the 20th century Eastern Germany. And he brings them into the German state, and kind of Bismarck learns the lessons from Napoleon. He understands that you have to create a powerful state in which every citizen is willing to serve the regime in order to throw power around in Europe, especially for such a comparatively small nation as the Prussians. The Prussians have qualitatively the best army in Europe, but they are the weakest in terms of population and economic might until pretty far into the 19th century. So how does Bismarck do it? Well, he makes the Prussian Junkers into officers in the military regime. So he creates this aristocratic kind of tradition of military service. He creates a situation where virtually every citizen, every man in Prussian territory becomes a member of the military. And so they're organized in sort of local militias under their local Junker. So they make them into administrators of the Prussian state. Now, initially, this is something that the liberal middle class is pretty reluctant to engage in. But after the failed revolution in 48, the middle class begins to decide that what they really want is national unification as a tool forward, that this is the way in which they're going to move forward into modernity. And so they see maybe liberal nationalism is a failed approach, and they begin to prefer Bismarck's style, which was sort of known by the label of blood and iron. Bismarck also has kind of a cunning sense. He knows that the liberals are going to be the most antagonistic to him. So they're never going to be a firm place within his coalition. And so what Bismarck actually does is he builds an alliance with the working classes of Prussia by creating a vast social welfare state that the conservative government is going to provide for them. So Germany is the first country to have national health care in the West. And Bismarck does this, and he does this essentially to kind of buy the loyalty of the working classes to forestall a socialist revolution. So this allows him to kind of have a Prussia that's tightly organized along the lines that he wants. How does he unify Germany then? Well, there's a certain amount of cunning. On the international scene, Bismarck works well to persuade the other members of the Holy Alliance that the real danger is the danger of a renewed France, and that the Germans and the Austrians and the Italians in Central Europe are weak, and Russia is not fully modernized, and so they have to work together to sort of provide buffer zones for themselves. But in the space between about 1860, say 62, in 1871, he launches a series of wars against his rivals for German domination and persuades them to become a part of maybe Greater Deutschland or Grosse Deutschland. This is an idea that Hitler kind of sees himself as being in the tradition of. Hitler kind of identifies this project as the project of the Third Reich. And what he says that what Bismarck was actually doing was creating kind of a second Reich after the fall of the First Reich, which was the Holy Roman Empire. So how does he does this? Well, he pushes into Denmark in the north and takes those two provinces of Schleswig and Holstein. He fights a war against Austria in 1866, a lightning war in which he mobilizes his army rapidly and is able to defeat the Austrians before the Austrians are fully aware of what's happening. He uses those victories then to kind of annex the states in the North German Confederation, creating a kind of a northern military alliance. In 1870 then, he launches them in a war against France, and in a series of kind of stunning military victories, at Sedan in particular, in the late summer of 1870, he decisively defeats France and forces the cessation of kind of some old Holy Roman Empire territories in Alsace-Lorraine to Germany, and uses this victory then to get southern Germans, the Catholic Germans, to join Greater Germany and creates a powerful centralized empire. This is a stunning accomplishment. And he does this without somehow disrupting the anti-French alliance system that had held together since the Congress of Vienna. So the Russians and the Austrians and the British are still more concerned about France than they are about the rise of Germany. In particular, the British have large sweeping colonial aspirations, and the British are actually much more concerned about the rise of Russia, because think about British possessions in India, British interests in the Near East. So they're, Bismarck is always able to persuade somebody on his list of potential allies that there's another person in Europe that you should be more afraid of than me. And so together we can work together. This is a dangerous game because he's also persuading the Russians that they ought to be more afraid of the British and the French than they are of him. And the Austrians seem to be the power that gets the raw end of the deal from Germany. But then, Austria is also German, and there's a certain sort of sense of solidarity. And there's this powerful idea of the Germans standing together against Napoleon III in 1870. And so this is a system that works. He keeps it together. And then in the late 1870s, Bismarck begins to move in a different direction. He sort of abandons liberal ideas of free trade. He forces the liberals to accept the centralization of political power in the army and in the Kaiser. He begins to box out the Russians. So a critical moment happens at the Congress of Berlin in 1878. Now, if you've read carefully from your maps, or you will read, you'll remember that in 1878 the Russians sort of invade the Ottoman Empire as a way to support the emergence of Serbs and the Serbian nation. And in particular, Russia wants Bulgaria to be independent and powerful. And so a large chunk of European continental Turkey is given to the Bulgarians. And the Germans decide that this makes Russia too powerful in the Balkans. And so there's an international diplomatic conference in 78 where they take territory away from the Russians. And as you'll see kind of in the next lecture, this is a problem. It's a sort of beginning of the end for for kind of German alliance with the Russians. But Bismarck's charisma and diplomatic cunning is such that he's able to really keep it together. In 1890, then the Kaiser sacks Bismarck and wants to replace him with someone more under his direct authority. And Bismarck sort of had this sense that there were natural limitations on German greatness, that Germany couldn't be seen as too demonstrably pushing itself forward as the leader of Europe because it would make everyone else quite nervous. And Wilhelm doesn't share these assumptions, and he really sets Germany up for a fall in the 20th century. He makes three kind of mistakes. Any one of these mistakes could be survived, but to make the three of them together, I think sets them up for disaster. So the first is just firing Bismarck, because Wilhelm can't do what Bismarck had done. In fact, nobody can. That's part of Bismarck's problem. But the second is that he begins this policy of naval construction to make the German modern battleship navy into a rival to the British. And so the Brits come to see that Germany is a greater threat to their sort of dreams of Atlantic commerce than the French are. As long as the French are pursuing a colonial empire in Africa, and so are the British, they're natural rivals. But the French had always sort of understood after Napoleon that one could pursue an empire in Africa, but one ought not to pursue naval dominance because it's the thing that will trigger the British. Germany doesn't seem to have a problem with that, and so that pushes the British into an alliance with the French. The third mistake is that in kind of operating in the Balkans, on the kind of the next concept, we'll talk about the collapse of Balkan Empire, the Ottoman Empire. Germany decides that Russian power needs to be limited, and so he kind of seems like he's frequently taking the Turks' side against the Russians, and yet there's no way to kind of turn the Turks into a great power. And he also he hasn't been a great friend to the Austrians, right? Because he defeats them in the war in 66 and 67. This sort of pushes Austria away from its German orientation and pushes Austria to kind of become the Austro-Hungarian Empire with a unified, not just a unified monarchy, but the idea was a unified polity. And so Russia then begins an entente, kind of a system of alliance with France. And so in the 1890s, you're moving toward this idea of a central powers bloc of Germany, of Austria, maybe the newly emergent nation of Italy and the Turks, with this grand alliance of the Russians and the French and the English, now clearly designed to limit German power, which is rapidly increasing. And that's the situation that this should set you up to do the reading in Merriman, which talks about the coming of the French Revolution. Let me say, not the French Revolution, World War I. Good grief, I need more coffee. Let me say one more note about, yeah, what this means. The first few pages of the Merriman reading I'm asking you to do are really about something called the Second Industrial Revolution. They don't deal directly with the question of World War I, but I wanted you to have something in print that would help you to think about the emergence of kind of what's happening. It's as if there's a dramatic acceleration of the Industrial Revolution that we've been talking about, right? So if you look at the British numbers, right, Britain is not a dominant economic power in 1500. And by 1700, the British Mercantile Empire has created a level of wealth in England. The chart that you're looking at here is the per capita gross domestic product. So not wealth, but kind of production. And it's in constant $1990. So you can see that, Britain is on this trajectory for dominance, right? And it's the Industrial Revolution that's taking it there. And then in the kind of the late 1830s, early 1840s, there's this sort of, the curve goes exponential and it goes up and it's moving up in a much more dramatic fashion. And although there are moments of reverse, there's a panic in the 1890s, and then you see a World War II crash. There's a World War I and World War II kind of dips there. But Britain's power is pretty much unlimited. And the textbook will help you to kind of figure out what's driving that. In particular, note the technological changes that vastly improve the quality of life. Improvements in transportation, in electric lighting, in public health. I like to joke that there's as much as we romanticize the world before 1800, like very few of us would actually be willing to go back and live in that world. I mean, there's no modern dentistry, there's no anesthetic. You're talking about plagues that routinely wipe out, 5 to 10% of the population, let alone, a 1 or 2% kind of crash. The world that we live in today is really something like miraculous, right? And so what you then see after 1800 are the attempts of other European powers to copy this, right? France and Germany are also aggressively moving upward. They don't have quite the level of wealth, in part because they're much larger countries with much larger peasantries, whereas Britain has sort of this consolidated urban area in London. And so the per capita wealth is part of what's so impressive about Britain. And then you combine that with kind of dramatic population growth in England. So you're seeing a rough doubling of the standard of living in the 19th century, with a population in England that's 2.5 times larger. So this really does make Britain into a dominant force. And the United States shares in this kind of industrial dominance. What the US doesn't have is the diplomatic game or the ability to project military power until the 20th century. Okay, but then look at this last set of data, right? Look at Spain, Japan, China, India, and you could put the Turks in there, right? There's this recognition in the mid-19th century, that Europe is doing something remarkable. And so we need to change with it or collapse. And China really, until the 1950s, is unable to change with it. In fact, China goes into decline. And part of what's so stunning in the last 50 years of our own time is that China and India are now in this phase of really rapid growth. Japan is able to do something really dramatic starting in the 1850s, and they begin this process of modernization. And the Turks, well, the Turks have this reputation of being the sick man of Europe. Everyone recognizes that they have this reputation and they have cultural glory, but man, they haven't done anything impressive since the 17th century. And in this battle for dominance, the others are beginning to slowly edge them out. So, all right, one more